Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for this webinar, which has been hosted by AHDB Dairy and Beef and Lamb. Many of you were probably expecting Amy Fawcett to be facilitating this evening's webinar. I'm standing in for Amy. I'm Jenny Gibbons, and I'm a Senior Dairy Scientist with AHDB Dairy. Our presenter this evening is Dr. Tim Potter from Westpoint Farm Vets, and he will be presenting on the latest information around pneumonia prevention and treatment and how to get the messages across to farmers. So the plan of action for tonight is that Tim will run through his presentation, and there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. We'll aim to finish up by about 8:15. You're going to all stay muted at home. But if you've got any questions, there is a box, question box on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can type in your messages there. Please feel free to do this as Tim is delivering his presentation this evening, and then I will facilitate the Q&A session after Tim has finished his presentation. So we've got 102 vets registered for this webinar this evening. My colleague Alana is going to be working behind the scenes, and she will endeavour to keep the webinar running as smoothly as possible. But please do bear with us if we encounter any technical difficulties. Of course, we'll try to keep these to a minimum. So without further delay, I would like to hand over to Tim. Tim, are you there?
Thank you very much, Jenny.
Excellent. Okay, the controls are all over to you, Tim.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. And as Jenny introduced, the plan for tonight is to give an overview and sort of update on some areas to do with sort of pneumonia. The presentation will be available after the event, and the sort of plan is that a lot of the slides have been kept relatively farmer friendly, so that if you want to make use of them, then that's fine, and they'll be available for you to do so afterwards. So the idea being that a lot of what's going to the discussion today will be around the slides, and we can pick up on questions at the end. So what's the plan? I want to talk a little bit about what the problem is, put it in perspective, and I think some of the figures there help with that discussion with clients, making them aware of the economics, both in management of cases but also the long term. Want to pick up on one thing in particular, looking at detection and farmer attitudes to it, and some of the complications that are arising around this, because I think everyone's currently aware of the need to be responsibly using antimicrobials, and I think what we're seeing there on farm is that actually it's a sort of how do we manage this, giving a message to farmers about needing to rapidly identify and intervene in cases, but then also at the same time giving them that message about responsible use of medicines, moving away from prophylaxis, and making sure that we're using the medicines available to us correctly. And I think sometimes that can create mixed messages, or people sort of taking steps and actually ending up in the wrong place. And then at the end we'll sort of pick up a bit on prevention, talk a bit around vaccinations, and then a bit about environment and some of the things that are going on in that area. So what's the problem? I don't think anyone listening or quite happy to have that debate afterwards will sit down and say that they've got farms that have no issues with respiratory disease. We can say that a lot will have it very well controlled, and there will be preventions, and the environment will be well managed, and we will see very little impact of it. But it's there, it's one of those issues that will be ever present in terms of management, and how we need to make sure procedures are in place to mitigate and to prevent where at all possible. Affects all stages of production. A lot of what I'll talk to about tonight is very much the focus around the sort of the younger calves, but some of the principles will be applicable to the older animals. And one of the things I find when chatting to clients about it and become acutely aware as we sort of move into computer-based recording systems is that actually it's really interesting to understand the sort of what a farmer's understanding of the disease, the pneumonia is, versus what they call a chill versus what they call a snotty nose. And actually what I've found recently is that a lot of when you chat to people or people where they've got issues with detection and rapid intervention is that for many, when we talk about pneumonia, yes, we as sort of vets will often say, all right, we're talking about the whole gambit of respiratory disease, that sort of they will frequently, the pneumonia to them often is meaning that very, very sick animal. And so I think there's a point to in terms of when you're chatting to clients and trying to get across messages about early identification, it's making sure the language is correct, making sure people are aware of actually there is a spectrum of disease, and what we're trying to do is make sure that actually we're picking it up early rather than waiting till we've got that recumbent animal that's in severe respiratory distress. Because certainly I think a lot of farmers, when you chat to them, they have this idea of that pneumonic calf is the one that's really struggling to breathe. And so I think it's sort of making sure that actually we're trying to get across that message about what the disease is and how it manifests itself. In terms of the agents, as I say, knowing the audience that's online tonight, the list is there of the different viral and bacterial pathogens, the sort of ones that we commonly see. And again, chatting to clients, it's stressing this aspect about the multifactorial, the nature of it. And for me, what I find is that actually the respiratory disease is often a way of actually sort of really engaging with sort of certainly the calf rearers and people rearing young stock, because actually it's the kind of environment where there isn't a one-size-fits-all vaccination plan. It's working with clients to work out, right, when are your risk periods? When do we see a problem, and how do we make use of the products that are available to actually fit in with their system? So that getting across that message about that multifactorial sort of nature of the disease is really important. And again, it's especially when you've got people that are starting to, probably that really difficult situation is where you've got someone that's previously been vaccinating, who's given up, and when you chat to them, it's just like, oh, well, we were vaccinating and it wasn't effective. And I think that's where there's a big thing about the education for people to understand that there are multiple different pathogens out there that can cause the disease. And so it's making sure that those sort of queries are addressed in the right way. And when starting to sort of talk about this sort of the disease, this slide here just to sort of prove a point about no farm being free of the disease. This is data from a few years back now, but lung lesions at slaughter, which looked across about 645 pairs of lungs from 15 different farms, and just scoring areas of consolidation, identifying that as an indicator of some kind of respiratory disease during an animal's lifetime. So it wasn't linked in, and data wasn't available on all the treatments that those animals had over their lifetime. This is just looking at point of slaughter, right? What were we seeing when we looked at the pluck as they went through the slaughterhouse? And what you can see from the data here is that actually there is a huge spread, but at all 15 farms, there were some animals that had some evidence of respiratory disease. And you'd love to know what was going on farm 6 in terms of the 100% of the animals exhibiting lung damage, and you wonder whether, right, that's the finisher that had the severe outbreak in that later life, whereas other ones we may sort of have slightly better batches coming through. But as a talking point with clients and a way of getting across to farmers, it's putting it in perspective that actually, yes, respiratory disease is there in the background and should always be something that people can plan around in terms of their preventative sort of medicine and look at ways of mitigating the impact of it. So what are the costs? And I think costs are always useful to start building in. They allow us to start providing justification for interventions. When we start talking about vaccination programs, it is an investment that farmers are going to have, we're asking clients to undertake. And so it's making sure that actually when we're talking about it, it's not just putting that sort of, right, here is the upfront cost of this vaccine. It's putting it in perspective. It's like, how much are you spending on treatments? How much is the loss of production worth to you? Be that daily live weight gain, be that long-term gains in terms of numbers, so if we're not having calves that are going to be entering into the dairy herd. And there are lots of ways, and I think people are often sort of fixated on how much did it cost for that outbreak of pneumonia in relation to the spend on medication at the time. And yeah, if they went down the line of metaphylaxis and had to batch treat a group of 300 kilo animals, they will be well aware of the cost to them relative and sort of related to the medicines there, but actually the bigger cost there will be associated with that production and reduced daily live weight gain, the lost potential there. And I think it's worth reminding clients and talking them through this, because it helps provide that full picture of what the costs there. And list there are some of the losses. So deaths are always going to be very apparent, although actually what we find when we go onto farms and do investigations, certainly in young stock, is that occasionally deaths aren't recorded as well as they might be. And we've got one calf lost here, another one lost in a month's time, and actually they go a little bit under the radar. And it's interesting, sometimes you're presented with a case that actually is, they talk about it as an outbreak of disease, and when you get to it, and when you start looking back through the records in terms of the performance of the animals, how animals look as a batch, what's gone on there with regards to the losses, the evenness of the animals in front of you, you start looking at it and you go, actually, this is not just something that's happened in the last couple of weeks or in the last few days. This is something that's been going on for a much longer period, and it's always good to not walk into situations blinkered. It's very easy, and especially when, certainly like our business, people are starting to charge by time for when their veterinary intervention on farm, that farmers sort of get, right, we'll take you to the problem, this is what we want you to look at, and you become sort of very focused on one area. And actually what you can then do is miss the bigger picture. So it's important to take a step back and look at the whole production cycle, because all too frequently, certainly last 2 or 3 big outbreaks I've been involved with, where people have highlighted a problem, it's animals that are weaned, looking at the stage when they're just sort of moving to finish, and actually, yes, they see a problem there, but when we look back through performance and what we see in terms of the disease pathology there, actually is that it looks like the intervention and identification of disease much earlier in the animal's life cycle is lacking, and what we're building up is animals that are perhaps poorer performing, animals that are carrying pathogens, that then suddenly we get a period of stress around weaning or a movement or a change in diet that actually that's sort of bringing on disease. And I think it's making sure that we as veterinary surgeons, when we're looking at problems, we make sure that we look at the whole picture rather than just being focused on what's in front of us right now, because it's very easy to look at that one shed and the outbreak there, whereas actually if you look at the whole farm and you see that perhaps actually the problem's starting in the previous shed or in the previous group. So putting some figures out on it, and the figures here, these are getting quite old now, but probably they give a sort of ballpark figure to start from. Overall cost for the industry, I think the AHDB figures, it's about £50 million. But if we're looking on an individual case basis, this is work from Andrews at the start of sort of around 2000, and the cost per calf and the cost on the dairy versus the beef systems. So 43 there for the dairy, 82 for the suckler, and that's for cases. And then actually, if you then average it out across the cost of animals at risk, the cost drops down, but it's still a significant amount. And when you start weighing these figures up in comparison to the costs of vaccines, the cost of potential changes in environment, and we'll talk about that later, because actually some of the newer technologies out there, looking at ways that sheds can be modified, now it doesn't necessarily need a completely new build, and that will allow people to quickly recoup on their sort of investment. And pie chart here, just looking at that sort of, what does that cost, what's made up of that cost, where does it come from? And yeah, the medicines and the vets sit there making up about 42% of the cost, but actually where does it, a lot of it's also sitting in weight loss, what's going on with labor, so time, effort that the farmers are having to do looking after that animal, and other costs associated with that, mortality and things like that. So it's a sort of, it's getting away from it just being about the sort of immediate cost of an outbreak. It's looking at it and the whole picture. So I said earlier about the signs of pneumonia and getting people to identify cases. And I think with the move and the sort of pressures that are going on across the industry to look at responsible use of antimicrobials, it's always good to be engaging with clients on identification of disease. So one of the areas where we as a profession have been perhaps criticized in relation to our antimicrobial usage is that we're prescribing into situations where we aren't always the person making that final diagnostic decision. We don't see every calf with pneumonia. We don't see every cow with mastitis. We put in place treatment protocols. And therefore, if we are making those decisions and we're prescribing in that way, we have a duty of care and a responsibility to ensure that the people that we are training to do that, the people that we're providing protocols to allow them to treat animals, that they are trained in the identification of disease. And it's making sure that they are aware of all the signs, and we are talking about them understanding the spectrum of the disease. So going from the mild cases or the animals in the early stages of the disease right through to that extreme case, which is very easy to see. And there will always be a spectrum of ability with the stock people that we are working with, in terms of their ability to pick out a sick animal, their understanding of disease, and we need to make sure that actually the training that we provide is robust. So there are scoring systems out there, and many of you will be aware of the Wisconsin score system that's there on the right-hand side of this slide. Used in many different ways. We have farms that will be using it as a regular way of checking up on what's going on in their calf units. Relatively labor intensive for that, but it may be a way of honing people's skills relative to the sort of disease diagnosis. Also potentially useful as a way of assessing what's going on in the unit as a snapshot. There are modifications of this system out there. There are different systems available. There's some that are a bit more simplified, some where they've dropped out the temperature, so actually it can be done as a much more as a sort of walk around without having to handle the animals. And certainly if for those of you that are using tablets on farm, if you go online, there's an app from the Wisconsin University which has this as a group scoring system, which can be a really useful tool that when you're assessing a group of animals, you can wander through the pens, count up, and actually it will give you a percentage of animals with cough, snotty nose, ear positions and things like that, rather than having to be reliant on going in and handling the animals. And however you use it, one of the key things is to be engaging with clients when you're going around and sort of looking at these the animals. And challenging sounds like an extreme word, but I think it's often good, is that actually it's to go around the unit with a list of the animals that have been treated perhaps in the last week, and with that in your hand, go around and say, right, well, actually, these are the animals that you have treated. How about that animal over there? And sort of it's making sure that your understanding of the treatment requirements and sort of your ability to identify animals requiring treatment matches that of the producer, because I think actually sometimes we get a bit sort of distant from it. We think that we're talking about one thing with pneumonia, and actually there's a sort of making sure that we minimize that mismatch, and having a standardized recording system, having a standardized scoring system that everyone's working from, that you are routinely sort of going back over, can be a really good talking point and a really good way of sort of actually following up on cases. And I think the follow-up is also important. It's making sure people are looking at cases and sort of seeing how things are progressing over time and checking off that they've recovered. Similarly, disease recording, providing simple ways of recording young stock diseases. I can really facilitate this. It may be in a farm diary. We're seeing people moving over to some of the computerized records, but charts like this one allow a very rapid visual means of disease recording that makes it very easy to pick up on, certainly if you're on dairy routines and things, that you can rapidly see what's going on in the calf unit and pick up on what's going on, because actually sometimes you're not necessarily aware, or people won't necessarily make you aware of what's going on. And having this, setting targets, benchmarks, saying, right, actually we want to follow up on this if we've got X number of cases in a month or X number of cases in a week, and having set points at which you intervene really helps people understand what they're aiming for and when they need to call for assistance or follow up on things. And where are we at with the causes? Data here from the submissions to national surveillance over this is 14 data. Pathogens, as I say, we listed up on the previous slide, and these are all based on submissions, so it will always be biased as to what people are going to actually send through and take laboratory samples through. But real spread of the different pathogens out there, big play on the bacterial ones, sort of PI3 is less so, but M. bovis sits up there, and the same Pasteurella and the Mannheimia and Histophilus as well. So there is a large component of bacterial pneumonia out there, and it's making sure that, okay, there will be therefore justification to use antimicrobials, but it's making sure that when we do use that, it's done in an appropriate way, but also that we are taking steps to reduce the implications and the risks of those, and also what we can do to reduce the impact that viral pathogens have that actually potentially allow some of those bacterial causes to take hold. And you do wonder, when we start looking at some of how the surveillance data gets skewed, because which animals is it that gets sent for the post-mortems, and the risk is that sometimes it's those end stage animals, those animals that have had previous disease bouts or haven't responded to treatment, so we may well get an overrepresentation of some of the secondary pathogens. So how do we sort of put it in perspective? Talked a little bit about lung lesion scoring earlier, and I think that there is an opportunity here to engage with people. The data coming out of abattoirs is getting better, and there is recording, and actually we've certainly got a number that we work with where we can actually go in and follow up and follow bunches of animals through, and it can be a very visual and a very good way of demonstrating effect and sort of what's going on to producers. So very visual, and it's the same as opening up animals on farm and doing post-mortems. Actually, when you open up an animal with lungs with sort of chronic pneumonia, it's very self-evident to the farmer why that animal isn't going to respond to treatment and what they're facing with regards to the disease process there, and why continuing throwing more and more antibiotics at those chronic cases won't necessarily bring back the lungs. So it can be a really useful tool in terms of education, but then also benchmarking what's going on. Similarly to calf scoring, there are different scoring systems out there. One of the more commonly ones is just to look at the different lobes, score per lobe. So 0 means no consolidation, 1 up to 50%, and then 2 greater than 50%, and then basically sum that up across the entire lung, and then you can classify, right, normal or mild, moderate if we've got a score of 2 to 4, and then severe if we've got over 4. So rapid way of putting a figure to this, having some objective data that we can actually go, right, how do we measure impact? Potentially it's looking at feeding back after the instigation of vaccination programs, or providing a means of sort of saying, well, actually vaccination is something that people do need to be looking at. Because I think one of the things to think about with regards to the lung lesions is that actually it's this idea of, right, what's going on in terms of the undiagnosed animals. And this data here is from some data that was presented last year at WBC. Lung lesion scoring again, and in this instance the treatment records were available for the animals, so it was possible to relate the lung lesions to previous treatment history from those animals. And actually in those instances, what was interesting is that actually, okay, we had animals on the left which were treated, and we sort of see the traffic light system there with severe, moderate and normal to mild effects on the lungs in the lung scoring. So within that you say, okay, well, the green, we've had animals where treatment was instigated. Potentially there'll always be cases that probably were treated that may not have had disease, but hopefully what we're seeing there is the animals that did have disease, and animals were correctly identified and then went on to make full recovery. I think probably when you start looking on the right-hand column, where you've got, these are animals that had no history of treatment. When you start looking at the sort of the yellow and the red there, it's starting to question what went on with those animals. What went on in those animals where potentially we've got moderate to potentially severe lung damage, and what was missed? Is it a case that these animals didn't show signs that were, or did they show signs that then weren't picked up by the producer, or where was their threshold for treatment? And I think this is one of the key things that we need to get very good at, especially with the sort of, with regards to use of antimicrobials. It's making sure that people are aware of the necessity to make accurate diagnosis of pneumonia, treat appropriately and treat rapidly, and not take it to the other extreme. I'm not sitting here saying that actually we want microbials. It's going to be a process of refinement. It's going to be a process of ongoing education to make sure that actually we're happy that units are consistently identifying disease and rapidly picking it up and treating it in the appropriate way. Because what's the long-term impact? And this is the data from that study looked at relative to live weight at 182 days. And we can see there that actually these animals that did have severe lung damage, much poorer performance in terms of daily live weight gain in comparison to animals with mild or sort of severe lung lesions. So it's all about actually, if we can minimize the impact of pneumonia, keep the animals in the green so that actually we don't have that lung damage, we can maintain the performance of them. So it's making sure that people see the benefits of early detection, but it's done in a controlled way, and looking at how we can do that is one thing that we wanted to pick up within this webinar. So what tools are available to us? So temperature monitoring. Historically, I think there was the real push to get people to be using rectal temperatures as a way of sort of actually, okay, well, look, I've got an animal in front of me, I'm concerned, how can I objectively look at what's going on disease-wise within it? And so the use of thermometers, and a lot of farms have adopted that, and they're quite happy doing that. And temperature monitoring has then moved on. So looking at probes that will actually identify and provide a visual cue, a visual identification of the farmer that the animal has got a temperature without having to catch up that animal and restrain it. So some of you may well have come across these ear tags that are now available. This is sort of the second iteration of them. But these are probes that will sit down within the ear canal, fitted like an ear tag. And it does take training in terms of the correct positioning, because otherwise the probe comes out, but they're reusable, and they can provide a really useful tool on the farm to aid in the detection. So what happens is the probe is reading the temperature about every 15 minutes, and then once you've had a period of prolonged pyrexia, the red light will start flashing, so that we have a visual cue to the farmer that that animal is pyrexic. Have proved really useful on some units. It doesn't necessarily make up for issues with regards to general husbandry skills, but can be a way of sort of honing things. So it can be a way of drawing people's attention to things, perhaps sort of adding as a supplementary way of helping people pick up on things for those people that are tuned into what a sick animal looks like. But like we said before, we need to make sure any of the interventions that we're putting in place are fitted in place around the responsible use of medicines. So we can't have it instantly going, all right, we've got a temperature, therefore we are going to start hitting those animals with antimicrobials, because it's getting people to understand, well, temperature can be caused by a number of different things. Is there a necessity for antimicrobials? And I think the key thing, if you're going to go down this way with clients and forget people using them appropriately, make sure they're well trained in, with regards to how they're placed, and that there are treatment protocols in place to describe what to do as and when that light does go off. How do you approach it? Is it a case of that animal just has a non-steroidal to start with and then progresses onto an antimicrobial? Make sure that those SOPs are in place, because otherwise I think you can find that sort of they miss the point a little bit, and actually it can cause more confusion about, right, what am I treating, when do I treat it, how do I react, and oh, the light's still going off, what do I need to do now? So it's making sure that if you have got people going onto these kind of systems, that there's control there, and view them as a way of engaging with clients. Other ways, monitoring feed behavior. So there are people who often are sort of historically talking about animals off hanging back and not eating quite as much. And actually, when we start looking at certain animals that are on milk, there's studies out there where we've looked more about making use of the data coming out of some of the computerized feeding machines. So this study published last year was looking at what the effect of different diseases was on the drinking parameters for animals. So looked at matched animals, so calves with disease and those without were matched, and then looked at what was the impact of diseases such as diarrhea, pneumonia, and also unspecified disease. So probably within that they counted naval ill and other things on feeding behaviors. So looking at that, and what this identified is that yes, there was a change in feeding behavior with most of the diseases looked at, but it varied depending on the disease. So diarrhea stood out as the one disease that caused the biggest change in terms of the feeding behavior. So for drink speed, for milk consumption, and unrewarded visits, so that animals going up and sort of actually not receiving any feed, or sort of actually depression in terms of the number of visits to a feed station, diarrhea had the biggest impact. So whilst this is perhaps not the best tool for looking at pneumonias, it is a useful tool for looking at looking at general disease detection. So as I said there, the figures on the brief summary on the right hand side, reference on the top, but they say drink speed, milk consumption, and unrewarded visits. For all of those, for diarrhea, they saw a drop in the positive behaviours, so drink speed, drop in milk consumption, and a drop in the number of unrewarded visits to the feeder for a couple of days or even up to 3 days prior to the case being diagnosed and treated, and then extended for a long period. For animals with pneumonia, what they often found is that actually it may be that they had some change on and around the day that the disease was diagnosed, but actually it was limited to a very short period of time. So it's a sort of making sure that actually the sort of alongside using these as detection means. And I think that's what we have to bear in mind, is that it's great having technology. We're all seeing it come into agriculture across numerous different platforms. It has to be used in unison with good stockmanship and looking at the animal. We don't want to create people that are based purely looking at computer systems. And I think highlighted this here because it's a tool, and the reason for bringing it up, it's no longer just in the laboratory. So this is a snapshot from one of the machines that's currently out on farms. So Forster Technic calf machines, currently the newer machines, have the ability to give this data out. So the drink speed, flag up and alarms, and it's available remotely. So it can be accessed via the cloud and via online. So it is possible to go online and see how animals are performing. So it's looking at the data that's becoming available, put it into context, and it's no longer about, all right, drink speed and this is about, that's a detection tool limited for the academic papers. No, this is stuff that actually clients are beginning to use, beginning to have access to on farm, and it's thinking about how do we use that to drive clinical decision making on farm? How do we use it to support accurate diagnoses? And I think that's going to be a key step. So it's making sure that, okay, right, we've got this data, what does it mean? Or I've identified that I've got a drop in drinking speed, what do I now need to look for, or what do I need to communicate to my clients to look for? So it's making use of that technology, because it's only going to become more and more available as things progress. So one of the themes that I've come across as we talked through today was always about antimicrobial usage and responsible use. And just want to put it into context and say there's a lot of movement going on in this area across dairy, across beef, and actually across the whole of agriculture. And looking forward this year, we'll see in a couple of months' time, rumours sort of looking to set targets in terms of the benchmarking for what different sectors should be using. So that's something that's going to be coming out this year, and probably be an area where we're going to be we would expect vets to be engaging in their clients on and looking at, because ultimately if we looked in most sectors, certainly in the beef sector and in the dairy sector, probably behind lameness and mastitis, pneumonia and respiratory disease will sit up there as one of the key areas where for cattle medicine we are using a lot of antimicrobials. So the pressure will be to look at how we're using that and to justify it and to make sure we're doing it in a responsible way. So this is just the some of the data that's out there on currently the sales. This was from 2015, and to look at it just in terms of the classes and sort of highlight where we're at. So tetracyclines would be what the sort of one area that of one type of product used commonly for respiratory disease. There are fluoroquinolones, and the third and fourth generation cephalosporins are licensed for respiratory disease, but probably there is, and hopefully there is, a move away for their use in terms of first line and second line for respiratory disease. One of the areas, and probably most of us will be commonly using products, is using the macrolides for the treatment of respiratory disease. Spectrum of activity, length of activity, ease of use, and those kind of products there's always been a bit of debate about where the macrolides sit, and just for clarification on that front, looking at what's going on within the UK and sort of this idea that actually, okay, do macrolides sit within the critically important list alongside fluoroquinolones and third and fourth generation cephalosporins, which if you look at the WHO list, they would do. Within the UK, I think the movement within the industry is that, okay, based on what the EMEA classification is, they sort of looked at breaking those down into a sort of category 1 and category 2, so low or limited risk to public health for category 1 and high risk to public health for category 2, is that this is sort of where the differentiations come between the fluoroquinolones, the third and fourth generation cephalosporins, and the macrolides. And this is purely a classification, and it's a purely to point out where sort of the policy is going. It's not saying that we should use any products irresponsibly, but it's where we're saying that actually the focus currently is sitting very much on the third, fourth generation cephalosporins, colistin, and the fluoroquinolones. The macrolides are there as a group. They have sort of sat in that borderline. They are one of the areas we may see changes in terms of the classifications for, but under current guidance, they're not necessarily the focus. They must be used responsibly, and this is the message that must go out to everyone, is that we should be using all antimicrobials responsibly, and it's not a case of, oh, it's not on the list, therefore it doesn't matter. That's not the case, but it's making sure that actually most of the focus is currently shifted onto the fluoroquinolones and the third and fourth generation cephalosporins, but it's being aware of that. Because within pneumonia and respiratory disease, probably for young stock or looking at the beef sector, is going to be one of the areas where actually there is a drift over to using group medication. It's how do we approach that disease outbreak within a group of animals. So slide here, sort of looking at how we use antimicrobials in the sort of the farm animal sector. And yeah, growth promoters have been banned, and that sort of, as we sort of sweep across from right to left, the next sort of step up from that would be prophylaxis, so that sort of use on arrival. And I think that's one of the areas probably when we look at young stock usage, we look at animals at risk of pneumonia, there's probably an area here where it's engaging with people to look at how do we successfully transition animals from one rearing system to another, look at how we minimize the risk of transport to reduce the need for prophylaxis, because that's what we need to be moving away from that. And actually, if we're going to be doing anything, we should be even further along and saying, what do we do about metaphylaxis, and how do we approach responsible prescribing there? So it's making sure that we're engaging with clients on this, that we're not just signing off and saying, right, yeah, someone phones up, oh, I've got a group of animals and I need to treat them, that's okay. It's looking at how do we make a sensible decision to intervene at the right time, but then also follow up with how do we look at interventions there to prevent it happening in the future, because we want to push as far as possible over to the left-hand side so that we're using small amount of antimicrobials and it's being focused in the animals that really require it. So it's that push, and that needs to be at the forefront when we're looking at anything to do with respiratory disease. Because medicine usage, and I think what we've seen over the last 12, 18 months, and we will continue to see, is this push for farmers to be better looking at what they're using in terms of medicines. We look at Red Tractor, there's now the requirement to look at that and sort of actually have that as part of the discussion and the health planning on an annual basis, so look at what the medicine's being used for, and that needs to be discussed with the vet. And it's a useful exercise, and I think it's something that actually ourselves as veterinary surgeons have a responsibility to do, but actually it's an easy thing for us to do. We can look at sales, we can making sure that we're actually, how are the products that we are prescribing being used? And if we're going back to right at the beginning of this presentation, how do we engage with clients? It's an easy way of us putting financial figures onto it, because at the end of the day, when we prescribed it, that product had a sale price. So it's an easy way of putting real figures onto something. So if we're starting to say, well, look, you spent this amount on antimicrobials, how about we shift this over to preventatives, or looking at what the investment in preventatives is. So having that, and this is going to be something that certainly my experience over the last, say, 12 months, even more, is there's been more demand for this kind of benchmarking, more demand for people to be looking at these figures as a way of actually quantifying what's being used, how it's being used, and actually going on farm and making sure that treatment protocols are being followed if they're there. And that's another key thing to do. And always use your health planning visits as a way of revisiting that and making sure that actually, yeah, we are tracking sizes and making sure we're at changing dosages accordingly. But it's not all about antimicrobials, and I think there is this thing about if we're going to actively get people to engage in identification of disease, looking at what we do for how do we getting people to pick it up early, is there a role for other products, or how do we treat and manage those cases that we're picking up really early? Because looking at the list of pathogens, half of the list there are non-bacterial, so antibacterials are probably unwarranted. So this was a study published recently looking at the use of non-steroidals as an early treatment, and this highlighted the fact that actually using the technology, so the ear tags, the sort of the fever tags, to identify animals with pyrexia, animals were then assigned either treatment with antimicrobial or a non-steroidal alone. And yeah, there were breakpoints put in place so that actually if an animal worsened when it was on the non-steroidal alone, or there were signs of overt disease, then it was given an antimicrobial. But actually 25% of the animals that were put on non-steroidal treatment didn't require an antimicrobial. So there is this, there's a growing body of evidence that if we can train people well enough to identify disease, we can make sure that actually they're following up on cases, so that actually, right, it's given a non-steroidal, we're monitoring it over the next few days to see how it responds, and that there are proper treatment protocols in place. There is a way of us sort of starting to look at identifying cases that we can use only a non-steroidal for, rather than having to go in with an antimicrobial as well. So in the same way that we sort of look into the dairy sector where we've got selective dry cow therapy, it's a good analogy to start thinking about how do I identify those cases where a non-steroidal alone. Takes some management, takes some training, but I think this is an area where there's a growing body of evidence, and I think there'll be increased push towards this over the next few years. So, talked a lot about detection, conscious of the fact that we were sort of running short on time, but I say wanting to be looking at thinking about the holistic picture. So for the calf, it's always going to be the interaction of what can we do to make sure the calf's in as healthy a place as possible, and how does it then interact with the pathogen and its also environment. It all fits together. It's not a case of one being on its own. So we can have a very healthy calf and it can then be able to fight off disease. But if we put that calf into a bad environment, or we overwhelm it with a extensive challenge, then actually we can still get disease. So it's being aware of that, and this is why in some ways these disease outbreaks can be frustrating, but otherwise they can also be really rewarding, is that actually it's looking at what is it that we can control and what is it that we can do to make things better. I haven't dwelled on colostrum, but I just wanted to make sure that I think if you're ever talking to clients about, and certainly for young stock and the sort of the real young calves, and we're talking about animals still on milk or just post-weaning, don't underestimate colostrum. And I think it's always worth revisiting that and looking at the effect that that has on performance and susceptibility to disease. So figures here, along with the references if you're interested, about what the long-term impacts are and why is it essential that we get that good colostrum onto it. Because frequently what do we find, certainly when we're looking at any kind of young stock disease outbreaks, actually there's a breakdown in some of the early stages of disease management and early stages of young stock health. So problems with colostrum feeding, issues with feeding, issues with the environment that have then allowed diseases to take hold. It's very rare do we find a new and emerging pathogen there. Often it's associated with a breakdown in husbandry. So worth remembering, worth revisiting when you're always talking about calf health. Vaccines, multiple different vaccines on the market, and I think within the realms of this presentation it's very difficult to pick up on exactly where to go, and I think the reason I often with clients will not necessarily go into specifics of vaccination programs, but get them bought into the idea of using vaccines is to make sure that actually whatever they do needs to take into account the risks on their specific units, be that pathogens, be that what's going on when they're buying in animals, when they're moving them, what they're doing in terms of the housing, how they're related to other animals on that unit. So vaccination needs to be a bespoke program, and it needs to potentially be tailored to farms, and it can be something that's always going to be need reviewing. Get people to buy into the idea of it's about preventing a disease in individual animals, but it's also probably about group management first and foremost. So it's reducing pressure, reducing shed of disease, and like medicines, it's ensuring everything's done properly. There is always the risk that, and frequently there's work that's been done, that people are spending money on vaccines that actually they're then not administering correctly, they're not storing correctly, and actually that will then have an impact. And there's certainly some good work published at some of the conferences recently where that's demonstrated that the number of fridges that aren't working on farms and people are storing products inappropriately. And I think, again, it's something to pick up with clients. If we're selling people what can amount to thousands of pounds worth of vaccines, it's making sure that actually they're going to see the benefit of it because it's being handled appropriately. Last couple of slides, just picking up on the environment. We all know what the risk factors are. It's anything that's going to cause stress and allow the sort of pathogens to multiply. So cold temperatures, hot temperatures, wet bedding, increases in humidity, lack of airflow, overstocking versus understocking. And I think that can be one of the areas where people can come a cropper. If we're looking at what are we trying to do and achieve with the ventilation, and it's saying, okay, it's very easy to walk onto farm and go, right, we need a brand new spanking brand new calf shed that we just sort of go and spend a lot of money on. Actually, you can, if you go back to the key principles about fresh air, we need to make sure that actually we're avoiding drafts and we're getting rid of anything noxious and we're avoiding humidity, then actually those are easy steps to start addressing in most sheds with a few changes. So the ventilation, the aim should be to remove excess heat, water vapor, the microorganisms, dust and gases that are coming out from the animals. We want a uniform distribution of air, so we don't want drafts, and so we want to avoid that kind of drafts at stock level, so we want the correct airspeed where the animals are, and especially important for the real young calves to avoid that kind of stress. So this is the kind of thing that, say, if you're ever talking to clients with, it's quite a dry subject if you're in a classroom basis. It's often better done on farm, where actually you can get them down to calf level and start getting them to feel and put themselves in the place of the calf. And I think that's the key thing for getting people to think about the environment. Humidity. So alongside the ventilation, we need to think about stocking density. We need to think about having that good ventilation to remove respiratory pathogens. How do we reduce humidity? So reducing the water outlet into the environment. So dry bedding, good drainage, regular cleaning out. And the cleaning out thing is one of those areas where it's sort of, you can go onto units and they're spotlessly clean, even all the feed passageways, the areas where people are working. And actually they can take it too far, and you can say, well, actually, hang on a minute, do I really need you to be hosing down your work area every day? Because if it's a concrete floor and we've got walk in there and it's spotlessly clean, but we've got a lot of standing water, actually we've dropped the temperature in that shed, we've put in a lot of excess humidity that we don't need, the calves are nowhere near it, and actually we're only doing it because it looks good. And I think it's something to manage there to make sure that people have got that good expectation. Stocking density, have in your mind some figures. So the RSPCA, sort of Freedom Foods have got figures there. There's guidelines and the welfare guidelines online about what your stocking density should be. And actually, it may be that for some people that are experiencing real issues with disease challenges, that it needs to be that it's working out what the economics are of taking a few less stock through a building. Because if you've got a building that you're jamming lots of animals into and we're ending up with dead stock at the end of it, or animals that never hit the right grade, those animals, is it worth actually going, well, if we don't put those animals in the first place, perhaps that reduces the disease pressure. And certainly I've got a number of clients where we started looking at that actually as the way to reduce antimicrobial usage, increase performance, and financially they're no worse off. So it's worth sort of looking at problems in different ways. For young calves, think about what's going on in terms of the stack effect. Everyone sort of talks about that, but actually for young calves, it will often be difficult to for them to create enough body heat to drive fresh air around larger sheds. So positive pressure ventilation, there are sort of number of systems that are being installed nowadays. Cost-wise, this has come down a lot, and actually this is a good way of providing fresh air into calf sheds. Needs to be bespoke, tailored to the individual shed, so the placing of the holes, the size of the fan, and the idea being that these are bringing fresh air in, uniformly distributed through the shed. So it's sort of the positioning of the tubes is key to that. So it may be a case, this is a system where there's only one tube, but actually often you may need, if for wider sheds, need to put two tubes into place. That actually this is a way of bringing fresh air in and avoiding drafts at calf level. So literally, if you're stood underneath this, you may just about start being able to feel a waft of air on the top of your head. It's that kind of, it's almost cascading onto the calves, if we sort of talk about it in a slightly poetic way, rather than actually being a draft. But that's worth looking at, and say, price-wise, that's come down significantly and is now a way of sort of upgrading a lot of sheds that are out there. And last thing, and say, to talk about is sort of those young calves, and how do we sort of make sure that we avoid stress for them. And it's sort of thinking about that environment. So thinking about, how do I assess it? How do I go onto farms and objectively score things? It's very easy to walk onto farm and go, I don't like the bedding in there or the air quality. But there are scores out there, and I think this is one of the key things with clients. It's trying to think about, how do I objectively assess there? So this is a scoring system for nesting. So this idea about, right, if I'm putting young calves into a shed and I want to avoid stress, and I want to make sure that actually they are in a comfortable environment, they're going to be less likely to succumb to disease, it's thinking about, okay, how can I assess that, or how can I objectively look at that with my client and communicate it to them if there's issues. So there are things like nesting scores, and we're encouraging people to look at these kind of scores as a way of going, okay, I'm walking around the shed, this is what I'd expect it to be. I want my calves to be a score 3 where you can't see their legs. I don't want to be them in a score 1 where literally they're just lying on top of the bedding and there's nothing that they're sort of able to sort of dig into. So it's this whole idea of providing guidance to clients, objectively looking at information, and allowing them to sort of look at, have data there that they can use to make improvements. So I'm going to wrap up there. Hopefully it's been a useful presentation. I say, what have we done? We've chatted over the pneumonia, it's given you some facts and figures there to put in perspective with clients, to start going, okay, what's this costing you? What's our opportunity there? What's the lost opportunity that we could look to address? Talked a lot about the issue of detection, and I think that's going to be a key area there, that area of how do we rapidly identify cases, why do we need to do it, but also how do I put that in perspective, and how do I align that with the needs to be responsibly using antimicrobial on farms. And then at the end we've talked a bit about prevention, thinking about vaccination programs, thinking about what we're doing with the environment. So happy to take any questions there. To say, the presentation will be available afterwards. If you want to do that, just please send an email to the brp@ahdb.org.uk, and as I say, if there's people that registered, you get notification when it's available online. So thank you very much.
Tim, that's excellent. Thanks a million. Just while I'm waiting for some questions to come in, just to reiterate what Tim has just said, that the slides from tonight's presentation will be available along with some notes if you want to go on and deliver the presentation to your client. So just send an email to the BRP email address that's on your screen now, and we'll make sure to send out a copy of those slides and notes to you. Yeah, please don't forget to send in a few questions if you've got any points of clarifications or questions for Tim. So I've got a few here, Tim, that we can probably kick start off with. Paul, good evening, Paul. Paul is asking, Paul's statement, I guess, is that we see a lot of BRD in winter, and in your opinion, how much of this is due to the environment versus lack of cold weather feeding in young calves?
Good question, and I think probably it will vary depending on the situation. I think there's a cold feeding in calves. I think that historically there is an area there where we haven't necessarily always been that prepared for. Over the last few years, certainly seen an increase in the uptake of people looking at what they do to address feeding as and when we get cold snaps. And certainly I've got a number of people I now work with where actually fine, we have a threshold with that actually below this point we will switch over to a winter feeding plan, and they know that it's almost you switch on that plan and then it stays on that plan for until you get through the winter, or at least we get into a sustained warm patch, because it's one of the areas that you can occasionally come unstuck is that people chop and change based on what the weather is on that day. But yeah, I think the cold weather, I think what I tend to find is a lot of it's the changeability. So it's not, the calves seem to do very well when it's cold and dry. When do we actually see the biggest issues with respiratory disease? I think frequently it's that transition period, sort of almost late autumn or going into early spring, when there's a bit more moisture around. And I think this is the difficulty we have with a lot of sheds where we are reliant on natural ventilation. We haven't moved in the same way as sort of the poultry guys are into sort of artificial ventilation within sheds to really control the temperature. So it's about what can we control in those sheds? Well, things like positive pressure ventilation can really aid delivery of fresh air, but as you highlight, that sort of winter feeding can remove some of the stress for those animals. Looking at what we do in terms of bedding and sort of to reduce humidity, but I think also you're starting to see, it's been an interesting watching the uptake of calf coats, and certainly the number of producers that are uptaking those and seeing real benefits from providing that as a way of reducing stress for calves, also maintaining those growth rates. But I think it's one of those issues where I think the feeding doesn't help. The weather we struggle to control, and short of going into artificially sort of heated buildings and totally temperature controlled environments, it's going to be very difficult for us to do anything by, but what we need to do is mitigate what we can change.
Okay, thanks. Tim, you mentioned calf jackets there. Any top tips or advice on what vets should be advising farmers around using calf jackets?
So calf jackets, real benefit, certainly in the younger animals. Get them on early, so they seem to be most benefit in those early weeks of life. If you've got people going on to them, make sure that people are aware of and have got practices in place for making sure they keep clean. Jenny will correct me, but I think the AHDB have got there's some good guidance notes on how to look after them and when to use them. Common problems that we see, people trying to take them on and off. So trying to chop and change depending on what the weather is. One jacket per calf, and then it's sort of used during that rearing period and then cleaned. Make sure that the calf is dry when the jacket goes on, so it's not a case of, all right, we've got a calf that's sort of wet, sort of newly born calf, we need to make sure it's dry first, or similarly we've had one transport and it's got wet, it needs to be dried first, because otherwise you're sort of putting the jacket onto that wet calf can cause issues. And then at the tail end, I think leave it on as long as possible, and then go to remove. When you go to remove it, the advice is often to take it off at the start of the day, so that actually you're not, so it has a chance to hopefully adapt to the temperature during the warmest part of the day before you get, rather than taking off at night just as the calf it's getting cold, and so it gives it the best possible opportunity to adjust to it. But very useful tools, and I think prices have come down a lot, and so people are seeing a real benefit from them. And if you're talking to clients about it, what's the best analogy? And it's about heat lamps. For people that have got mixed enterprises, you start talking about, I've got clients who will think nothing of heat lamps for an individual lamb, or bringing the lamb inside and sort of keeping it warm in the kitchen, and then you say, well, actually, what is it you do for your calves? Because if we talk about the economic value of that one individual animal, where does it sit? And I think there's a bit of a change of mindset there to say, okay, well, actually, we'll do this for a lamb, but we won't do it for a calf. Well, actually, yes, it's bigger, but actually, it's no different in terms of its metabolic state or its the impact of cold on it.
Excellent. And yes, just to highlight that we do have a fact sheet on best practice around using calf jackets, and you'll find that on the dairy.ahdb.org.uk/calves webpage. So that's just the dairy website /calves, and you'll find it there. I've got another question here, Tim, and I think it was in relation to the slide you put up about precision technology or automation around measuring or monitoring feed intake. And the question is the use of feed monitoring dependent on default levels of feeding? If underfed, maybe a later parameter to change if well fed because calves are very hungry.
Yeah, and I think that's where it will be. So the technology would be dependent on, you'll have to take it into account what your feeding regime is. And absolutely, if we take it as read that actually if we're feeding on a system where actually most of our calves are restricted, that will potentially drive us to sort of pick up on issues maybe a little bit later. Because it's sort of, we miss out on that sort of slight, they're almost a bit underfed to begin with. But the systems, and so the system I showed you there of the force machines, that is what they're showing there is it gives you a visual alarm and a visual comparison of what's going on from that day and the previous day relative to the feed plan that's allocated. So as long as you know what the plan is, what it's doing is it's allowing you to look at that, how much has that calf taken relative to yesterday. And yeah, absolutely, we have to factor in the fact that we are restrictively feeding these animals, and therefore potentially the sort of at what point we detect it will be different. The study there is an American system, and interestingly, the figures that were quoted there, they were, when you looked at what those calves had access to, they were on a very accelerated feeding system. So the figures there in terms of the -3 days to the end of study period, which was 2 or 3 weeks, was actually based on a system where they had, a lot of those calves had access to coming up for 10 to 12 litres of milk a day. So they were potentially had a lot more feed availability than we would for a lot of systems within the UK. So that's where that data comes from. But the systems themselves are capable of, you can look at that and you can look at it relative to what's available to the individual farms on individual systems.
I've seen these technologies on poultry farms in a previous life, and yes, they can be very, very useful. And so I guess some fun technology is being developed at the moment for our own industries. Robert, just to highlight, yes, the webinar is being recorded. and it will be available hopefully within the next couple of days. You will receive an email to let you know when it's been uploaded onto the AHDB Dairy and Beef and Lamb YouTube channels. And if you want a copy of the slides, make sure to email the BRB at ahdb.org.uk. So an interesting question, probably the final one of the night, I suspect, is any thoughts around using ultrasound to determine lung damage and to determine whether the calf is worth treating or keeping?
So really good point, and there are, and what I can do is I'll pull some papers and I'll make sure they're circulated with the notes. There's been quite a lot of work here done, certainly in the US, about making, how do we make that decision? And I think in the interests of responsible use of medicines, and it's an interesting discussion on farm, when you start looking through medicines records and you go, okay, well, I can benchmark this farm on what's used. When you start picking it apart, you can then go, well, hang on a minute, there's one calf or two calves here that have had, probably may account for a third of all the antimicrobials, because it's that one calf that's had multiple treatments and has not necessarily responded. And I think there's an area here where potentially ourselves as veterinary surgeons need to be looking at, how do I make that decision? How do I provide my client with an objective measure to go, right, this calf isn't going to be viable long term? An ultrasound of the lung fields is a really useful tool to certainly pick up some changes. You have to bear in mind that you can only assess the surface of the lung, so you won't necessarily pick up all lesions with it. It can be quite difficult in young calves to get the probe between the ribs, but actually most of the time you'll be able to get some visibility there. You don't necessarily need to clip the animals, and you can use a rectal scanner, so just make sure that the coat is soaked through. Water will do just as well as alcohol, and then you can look for the two bright lines of the pleura moving across each other, and you can pick up consolidation, because certainly if you've got roughening of those surfaces, if you've got large areas of fluid identified on ultrasound, probably the prognosis is poorer. But it's certainly something that we've tried on a number of farms, and it can, for the individual cases, can be a useful way of providing a bit more objectivity to, right, this animal, we are, it's perhaps not the best candidate for continued therapy, or at this point we go, rather than it just being, we've had this course of antibiotics, we've tried this, and we're going to stop. It's we've tried this, or we're making a decision about where our next step is. Actually, it allows us to make that decision with a bit more information, than rather than just saying, which I think for some clients will always be quite difficult, is that we've tried this and we've tried this, now we need to stop, and we just get rid of the animals being non-viable. It's a useful tool to add to our armory, and actually it's a good thing for us as clinicians, because it's another way of us making use of the scanner that probably a lot of us are carrying around in the back of our cars. It's equipment that's available to us, but I can certainly send around some more references on that.
Yeah, that would be really useful. Thanks, Tim. And I just put the URL to access the calf jacket fact sheet into the chat box. So if you've not seen it, then just have a quick look at the chat box, and you can access the calf jacket fact sheet from that URL. So right, we're kind of bang on 12:15. So just a big thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. We've had a really good turnout, and thanks for those that have submitted some questions and kept the discussion going for the last 15-20 minutes. Tim, I'd especially like to really thank you for sharing your expertise with us this evening. And just to the rest of you still listening, please do email us for a copy of those slides. If you would like to use them with your clients, the email address is still up on the screen in front of you. So we've got a couple of webinars coming up. Next Tuesday, we have more of a dairy-focused webinar. We've got Neil Chesterton currently running around the country delivering a number of farmer meetings for us. And I'll be hosting a webinar with Neil next Tuesday evening on reducing pressures on the hoof. So that's next Tuesday, August the 29th at 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock. And then on the 5th of September, we've got another webinar on pneumonia, but this time specifically targeted for dairy farmers. And that will be with Colin Penny. So please do signpost any interested farmers to both of these upcoming websites. They'll be able to find them advertised on the events pages of our websites. So without further ado, I just thank you all again for your participation and bid you good night.